I think we've got used for the last 18 months of this trade war has been rolling to a lot of bumping around. And certainly in the last 2 weeks, we've seen two sets of developments. Both the Chinese and the American side have announced probably 3 sets of tariff exemptions, all designed to create a positive atmosphere for the substantive trade negotiations, which will resume on the 10th of October. Then, pushing in the other direction, you have the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, unleash, I think, on the 24th, about 3 days ago, in the United Nations General Assembly, the full-scale attack on China's global trading practices, not exactly on cue with the rest of the strategy being pursued in the White House. So if you're a Chinese trade negotiator right now, you'd be a little confused as to what signals are being sent out. Maybe it makes sense in the White House, but I'm not sure that they're going to see it that way.
Kevin, you follow the Chinese closely and are known for reading the tea leaves. How do you think the Chinese could respond if the White House moves forward with delisting Chinese companies here in the U.S. and cutting financial ties between China and Wall Street, which has been a growing destination for a lot of big companies in China?
I think one of your earlier contributors kind of got it right when they said, what powers does the U.S. president have to, as it were, forbid U.S. companies from investing in China? So there may be a gap between the presidential rhetoric on the one hand and full presidential powers on the other. But what I think the Chinese fundamentally are concerned about is the general drift towards, let's call it, longer-term economic decoupling. Trade, we've just discussed. But when you start to move on to tech and the Huawei matter, that's big. But then you start to talk about finance, whether it's on stock markets or more broadly, restrictions on FDI, and maybe digital finance, and because that affects the Alibaba stocks that you referred to before, we then find ourselves in a whole big and I think more dangerous ball game. So my own hope is that we can stabilize this through achieving a trade outcome before the end of this year. And I think that's still a prospect.
Kevin, what do you make of some of the debate about whether the Chinese now, whether it's because of short-term political pressure on the president and talk of impeachment, or just broadly the fact that we're only 13 months away, that the Chinese will wait now until there's a new president in 2020, or potentially new president, I should say, of course, in 2020?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think I would have had a fairly definitive answer on that prior to the announcement by Nancy Pelosi on the 24th of September that impeachment proceedings were going to proceed. Absent that, I think the Chinese had basically factored in all the variables in American politics and concluded that on balance it was best to proceed and try and do a deal by year's end. That's my judgment of the Chinese sentiment. I was there just a couple of weeks ago. But I think on the impeachment matter, it throws out a whole new variable, which I don't think any of us were anticipating. And therefore, it depends now, I think, both on 2 things. One, how substantive is the political problem now for President Trump? Or is it just one of those things that comes and goes in American politics? And secondly, if it is substantive, then the Chinese calculus will be, how big will he play the diversion strategy, which is to throw rockets and bombs, metaphorically at least, in China's direction, trying to be the tough guy on China in the lead up to the end of the year, to distract attention from his substantive political problems here on the home front. For me, that's now an open question. It hangs entirely on how seriously substantive this impeachment matter over the Ukraine is in the president's eyes.
How do you think next week's China's National Day, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, Kevin, could change the dialogue as we await those trade talks to officially kick off on the 10th of October?
I think from the Chinese perspective, 1 October, 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, is almost exclusively a Chinese domestic political matter. It's all about the internal legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And the message will be simple. The country was a wreck in 1949. It had been dismembered for the previous 100 years by foreign imperial powers, and the Communist Party put it back together. And look, guys, 70 years later, we've turned this country into the world's 2nd largest, and by one measure, already the largest economy. So it's a domestic political celebration. In terms of the impact on sentiment towards these negotiations, I think the Chinese are deeply pragmatic. They will simply try and make a bottom line call about whether the president is going to be pushed off course from his previous posture on the substance of the trade negotiations by the new impeachment reality. If they think this is a passing phenomenon, then I still think it's a prospect we'll get a deal before the end of the year.